Hello, everyone, and welcome to Schmidt List. I am your host, Kurt Schmidt, and today's show is meant to inspire and educate leaders in technology and design. So, before we jump right in, because I have an amazing guest, and we have a topic that could be a little controversial in the space that we all work in. So, but before I get started, I do have to do a quick plug for the book that is out now. So make sure you check out the Little Book of Networking. It's available on Amazon, and you can get it there. And then if you like it, make sure you leave a review because reviews are super helpful. All right. So today we're going to be talking specifically about the methodology that we call Agile. We're going to talk about big A Agile. We're going to have a little A Agile. We're going to talk about asterisk Agile. We're going to talk about all the different things that have to do with that. But first, let me introduce my guest, who is much more of an expert than I am. I'm going to learn a lot from him today, and so will you. So, David, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Kurt.
Good, good. Thanks for being here. So, David, tell me about what do you do? What's your background? And yeah, what do you do?
Well, I've been doing UX since before it was cool to call it that. That's sort of what I always say, because when I started, it sort of had a name, but it really didn't have a name.
Yeah.
And we were sort of doing it and sort of not doing it. And so it was really interesting. There's a lot of people doing like HCI and UCD kind of in
Mm,
some places, but I would say it was still a little bit nichey outside of a few really orgs that were focused on it.
yeah. You were the
Um,
wireframe guys, right?
Yeah, wireframe guys. They were kind of doing some user research. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
trying to belittle what came before, but there
Sure.
were definitely phases of maturity that we were going through, right? As a
Yeah.
as a profession.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I've been doing that a long time. Really, one of the things that we did that early on when I was running my agency, which turned into a UX agency, I didn't really intend for that to happen. I think a lot of people who get into UX, they didn't really intend to come into UX, but they just sort of end up there.
Mhm.
And it's not in a bad way. It's just kind of where they're called to go, right? Based on the things that they do and the things that they know. And there are certainly some folks that, choose it as a profession, but
Yeah.
um, what we were using, we found out really early that a little bit of market research combined with UX research can really drive your product strategy, right? It can really
Mm,
tell you where to go and be predictive in crazy ways. And, getting clients to listen to us back then was the biggest struggle, right? And then, having the market after they didn't listen to us, having the market then, you know, bear out the truth, right? Is sort of the kick in the teeth. But,
yeah, having to
um,
prove your value is a pretty regular thing. Just well, whether it's UX or
yeah,
any role in this in the digital industry can be very challenging, right?
Yeah, there was a certain client where they were looking at their digital platforms and going and just trying to decide what to do, and we pretty much predicted where the market space was going to go for them 5 years or 6 years ahead of where the market space went. Right, so and it was totally within their budget and totally feasible to do, and they didn't do that. Someday might write a book about that because it's a really fascinating, like organizational saga epic. That's really
Yeah,
fascinating, but that was the kind of stuff that we were doing for all
yeah,
kinds of different products.
and that
Um,
was in the waterfall era too, right? I mean, that
oh
was
yeah, that
we
was in
were.
the waterfall era. That was on-prem software. That was
Hmm.
all kinds of. This was the beginning of the digital age, right? I
Yeah,
say that and it sounds like I'm, peeking out from the cave looking at dinosaurs, but kind of felt like that sometimes back then. But that's
you
not really how it
chiseled
was.
wireframes into stone, right?
In
And
the stone tablets, we
yeah,
used
right.
to
Yep.
create lighting effects and animation with fire and
Yeah,
a
I mean,
wheel
the drop shadows had to be
over it.
really difficult
Right,
to get
exactly,
right.
so, forget about putting it in
So
the cloud, right? That was too high.
right.
Couldn't propel
So,
anything that high. We didn't have the technology, right?
that's not an I, that's a one. Okay, so we're here to talk about methodologies. We're here to talk about Agile specifically. Obviously, there was a big change in the last 10, 15 years from this idea of let's define everything, let's make sure it's locked down, and then let's build the thing, and then let's launch it, and then let's do what we call maintenance. And then over time, we got into the thought of, well, maybe this is something that's more iterative, right? Something that we can do over time. So tell me about your experience initially when you first started using or experimenting with Agile in the work that you do.
Well, I think Agile's great, right? The concept of testing and learning is sort of fundamental to, or testing and adapting is kind of fundamental to, UX. UX does it in a little bit different order. Preferably, we do learn, test, adapt, right? Agile prefers to, to test, learn, adapt, right? So it's really kind of semantics. So from a UX perspective, I thought this is great, right? This is what we already do, and to then fit that into the software context that we were already working on just seemed
Yeah.
it seemed natural to have us be more plugged in with the development team, the delivery teams, and
Yes.
then really working closely with them to figure out feasibility. Because one of the big challenges, in early UX was we design a whole bunch of great things, and then we'd hand them off to the developers, and they would go, "That's not even possible." Right?
This
We'll just
doesn't
use
work.
yeah, we'll just use Macromedia Flash, right? It'll be fine. We'll just use that, right? We
Yes.
can make anything happen there,
You
right?
can
Like
make anything
that's
happen.
our good, right? So that dates me a little bit, but that's okay. So this sounded really great, and as I started working with clients agilely, and then getting roles in organizations that were working agilely, this was fantastic, right? We could definitely test and learn incrementally, and then really be smart about how we were testing in
Right.
production and what we were testing through concepts, right? And really being really wise about it. And then I experienced something really weird, and and I guess I got lucky because I was working with organizations that had evolved agile a little bit or adapted agile. I got to work with these clients where the only place we could test was in production, right? Like there was no like, it all went to the engineers, and the engineers, you worked with the engineers, and then you stuck it in production, and then you monitored and you looked, and that didn't make any sense to me. I'm like, why would we put something wrong in front of the user, or that might be wrong, right? Without testing it, especially when testing it doesn't cost us that long. It doesn't take too much time, right? Well, we can't waste time, right? We've got to get stuff done, right? Well, if you've got a UX loop that's just a couple of weeks ahead of that, then just to do usability testing, just to make sure we didn't make something unusable that somebody can't figure out how to use, right? This is commodity stuff like that. I
Yeah.
didn't understand it. And so that's when I started to get exposed to these more, dogmatic practices of agile. And then when I went to Taylor Corp, I had a green slate. I got to,
Yeah.
in Taylor Digital, when we were forming that group, we got to do whatever we wanted, right? So we put together really sort of this really neat kind of almost tri-track agile, dual track agile, whatever you want, however you want to think about it, where we had a discovery funnel up higher, right? That was doing some level of discovery work, and then usefulness and usability were really brought into the product team, and the UX designers were working on an iterative cycle just slightly ahead of where development was. So we're not talking about like a really long, like 6 month lead time or anything like that. We're talking about really things that were really, really close. And that
Yeah.
worked really fantastically well. But it illustrated to me, you know, Agile, kind of the Agile was stuck. Something was wrong, right, with
Mm.
Agile. And a lot of it was frameworks, right? We were
Yeah.
stuck in whether they were, Scrum or safe or made up frameworks or implicit frameworks.
Six Sigma.
The, yeah,
Um,
this kind of dogmatic rigidity, right? It really
well, yeah.
didn't.
But again, the frameworks come from a need to communicate, right? They come from a need where people want everybody on the same page. So we all follow this framework. And if we
Right.
have this framework, right, that's going to align all the teams. It's going to align everybody around this central idea. But why isn't it you've seen that? Why have you not seen that work, David?
Well, I don't think it's necessary. I think if you've
Okay.
got a self-empowered team, they should be able to adapt the working structure however they want, right? Or however they need to. I think that's kind of the most important thing from my perspective.
Hmm.
Is that they can do that. And so when I think about, and so then, the other things that I think are really interesting is that, they're supposed to be a self-empowered teams. That's one of the fundamental assumptions. But yet you've pretty much got, a product owner who's in a lot of cases running the show, right? So they're absolutely running that. They're running everything that's coming through the team. They're kind of owning it, right? And that
Yep.
seems unagile as well. And so that really
Right.
hasn't worked. I don't think that's worked out well at all. But um,
Well, the other thing that
it really,
you and I talked about this previously is that the idea of these. Do you think it's a problem of scale, maybe? Because you always hear about these startups, right? Where you've got these 5 people in a room, in a closet, basically just knocking through things. They're very empowered. But then you go to a large, giant company like a General Mills, right? Or Intuit, or different types of large organizations. Is it a problem with scale with empowered teams? Can you because again, you do need to manage output, right? You do need to
Yeah.
understand and be able to manage to that, right? You need to be able to know, when do I need to hire more people, or when do I have too many people on staff? So
Sure.
there
Yeah.
needs to be some sort of input into a larger system so it can be managed. But if you do have these, when I hear CEOs hear the idea of self-empowered teams, to them it sounds like anarchy. It's anarchy. It sounds like the lunatics are running the asylum, right? So tell
It
me,
should
tell me
be.
your perspective.
So, and it should be. The problem is that leaders, so the problem is leaders, right? Leaders don't understand how to communicate strategy, right? And that's what needs to get communicated. They're used to communicating in tactics, right? Many leaders are promoted from operational backgrounds, right? A lot of them. I bet if we went out to LinkedIn right now and we just did a poll of, a sample of leaders,
Sure.
we find a lot of them came from backgrounds that are operational excellence, right?
Yep.
Because that's what management is about. It's about operational excellence. And so you're talking about individuals who probably don't have any background, very little background in communicating strategy, right? They just don't have that. They just don't have that skill set. Agile doesn't teach that, right? So how
No.
do I take it? How do I communicate something that allows me to keep my teams aligned? That's pretty tough, right?
Yep.
That's a new skill for most leaders.
Well, it
And I
takes
think that's
experience,
probably
right?
one of the,
It takes
yeah,
experience, and not just tenure, I guess, right?
right.
Um,
Right.
so
And I think when we separate the difference between, you know, feature accumulation, which is the early part of every project, right? You go through this
yep.
in Agile, right? You go through this
Yeah.
period where you're just crunching out features, right? That's what
Yeah.
you're
Because
doing.
you want to know, what does this thing do, right? What is the
Yeah.
value it provides?
You've got a critical mass that you need to meet, right?
Yep.
And then you get to optimization. The problem is that teams never reach that optimization point.
No,
They never do.
no.
Right? So what happens is that teams reach a point where they reach their critical mass. They've launched all this stuff. Some of it's not good, right? In production, some of it we is wrong, and our data might even be showing it's wrong. We'll stopgap the worst bleeding, but then what happens, right? We see it all the time. Engineers start getting let off that team, right? Until there's one engineer left. Our UX person, probably only a quarter devoted to that team until
Yep.
there's more features to work. But it goes back to this whole idea of how companies measure and how leaders measure. They shouldn't be measuring work output, right? They should be measuring to a goal or some sort of other metric, like a goal, like whether it's a data goal or an OKR or some sort of
Hmm.
feedback status that they're getting from their research or voice of the customer channel,
Yep.
whatever that other goal is what they should be working towards. And then that should be driving it, not output, right? But again, it's the mindset of operational excellence. I have to do things, right? It's not about doing things. It's about achieving goals, right? And so that's a different mindset for leaders as well. I'm not trying to pin the whole feelings of Agile on leaders, right?
Sure.
That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just saying
No,
that
I get
leaders
it.
often are ill-equipped to deal with this, with these changes that are happening and how it works.
Is that because
Um,
is
you
that
know,
because
the,
this is a newer way of working, because we haven't worked this way for 70 years in industrial society? Why do you think that? What do you
yeah,
think the real problem is
I,
there?
well, I think we just I think we don't have a practice
Hmm.
for Agile leaders. Like within a company, you'll have a UX practice, you'll have a product practice, you'll have a development practice, right? Where you've got more senior people that are helping level up people on the teams, right? So whether their job is to implicitly kind of work in there in the teams and help upskill people, or if it's more kind of coaching from the sidelines, helping other sub leaders do that work too, right? There's very little, practice up leveling here. And even if you go out in the Agile community, I've not found a ton of courses that help tell leaders how to communicate strategy. There's lots of stuff about like building roadmaps and, predicting when work is going to, finish and when we're going to get these
Right.
features done. But
How to
there's
track
not a
things,
ton
right?
of, yeah, there's just not a ton of how do how do we think about strategy? And there are in tangential ways, like you can go learn about OKRs, you can go learn about, other sorts of things. But in the agile community, there's no cohesive from the delivery all the way to the leader way of communicating what's happening, right? Or
Mhm.
what's going to happen. And it's
Yep.
just not there. And I think that's part of where we got stuck, right? I come back to that, right? This is where Agile didn't evolve because we got stuck in these frameworks. And really what should have happened is that people should have been evolving these things, and and there's some, there's good teams, there's good companies that have. I've
Oh,
certainly been
sure.
on
Yeah.
them where
Right.
they looked at something and they said, we're going to change that. And, the organization said, no, you're not. We're like, no, we're going to change it because
Yeah.
what you're saying is not going to work. Right.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
that's, that I think that's I think that's a big part of what's
Yeah.
next for Agile is just taking off the constraints so it can evolve.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
Scrum's the big one, right? And Scrum, I always tell people, Scrum is training wheels for Agile, right?
It is.
And what happens when you don't need the training wheels anymore? Take them off, right?
Right. Yes, exactly.
I
You
mean, you
don't
can keep
you
riding
don't double
them, but
down.
right, exactly. You don't, yeah. And so recognizing the shortcomings of the frameworks also, right, is part of the structure, right? And you just
Yeah.
get kind of dogmatically stuck and you can't see past the flaws. You're like, oh, this works, this works.
Yep.
Does Agile work well? Like you said, at a big company that's delivering value through multiple channels. Let's imagine you're at retail, a retail client, right? You've got stores, you've got associates, you've got managers, you've got customer service, you've got logistics, and then you've got digital, which is really a small slice of the pie, right?
Yeah.
And so how does a how does a team who's launching a new feature coordinate that across the whole org? I'll
Hmm.
tell you, they usually don't, right? They usually don't because they're kind of isolated in their silo. Once in a while, if you've got a really great product manager, which I've been blessed to work with, they know that their real job is business efficiency,
Right.
operations,
Yep.
creation, and revenue, right? They know that they're not focused on the user. They know what they should be doing, right?
Yep.
And so they're going to do that. So
Yeah.
those are the sorts of, but Agile doesn't do that naturally. Agile
No.
doesn't do that, natively. And so again, it's about how can we adapt that? How can we, do that? And there's some folks that are working around agile, value streams where they're trying to take that agile concept and stretch it across you know, a whole stream of work or value delivery.
Yep.
But why are we forcing operations to work agilely? Why are we forcing customer service to work agilely? Do we really want operations to be disrupted by an experiment? I mean,
Yeah.
how
Right.
much risk mitigation do we have to do there? So those are the sorts of things where, I kind of look at it and go, yeah, nice try, but I don't think we're getting there.
Yeah.
Sounds good
Let
in
me.
theory, but in practice, maybe not so awesome.
Well, sure. I mean, let me. Okay. So one of the challenges I've heard, and I'm just playing antagonist here, is that because like you had talked about the idea of being able to experiment and there wasn't a testing and staging and all these different environments where you could actually do these things, is that the leadership is like, why do we need to test these things? Aren't you confident in your choices? Aren't you confident in your job and the decisions you make? Why can't we just push it straight to production? So what's your answer to that?
Sure. I mean, if you like guesswork, right? Like I'm a professional, right? But when I know that I can test with 5 users and find 85% of the day one usability issues that could plague our users, right? Why wouldn't I do that? It takes two
Yeah.
weeks, not even 2 weeks, right, to do it. And so why wouldn't I? But if you're comfortable shooting from the hip like that, that's fine. Probably not a company I'm going to work for. Probably not a
Right.
company that's going to have great success in the long run, right? So even there's some giants that do that, and their software is not well loved, right? It's used because they have a monopoly on the market,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it's
You're
not well
stuck
loved.
using it. Yep.
Yeah, and they're agile, right? But they're not testing and learning
No.
because the cost of testing and learning for them is high, right? Because their software solution is complex.
Yeah.
And the more, that's the other thing at scale, right? The more complex your software, even if you've architected it really, really well, the more cost it is to change, right? Just out of simple math, right? you can modularize and do all kinds of other things like that. But at the end of the day, you know, it's just complex, right? There's a lot of interactions, and the bigger your scale, the more cross-functional change you have to manage, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of another whole slice of the pie that, yeah, does Agile work at scale? Probably not. Does Agile work on its own? Yeah. I mean, if you've got a single kind of product where you're delivering value through one channel, yeah, Agile will work fantastically, right? Agile will work great. And, that's, a whole,
Well,
whole
yeah.
ecosystem to itself, right?
Well,
But
but
there's
that's the
not
thing
that
is
many.
we're stuck with it though now. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the way we have to work. And so how do we fix it, David? How do we
Yeah.
improve on it? Do we do more frameworks? Different ones?
Well, I mean, I hate to say framework because that's not what I want to do. I'm
Yeah.
working with some folks to come up with something that's customer centric, right? So really taking this idea of how do you do agile, agile-ish stuff at scale, right? So
Yeah.
taking the best parts of agile, right, and kind of dumping the stuff that's not useful or doesn't fit right with real world scenarios, right? Agile is
Mhm.
a bit, when you talk about the manifesto, there's a little bit of idealist there, right? Like there's no way around it. It's not completely pragmatic, right? So there's
Well,
a
for
bit of
sure. It's like,
idealist
well,
there.
but it's like the
But
10
yeah,
commandments, right? It's
yeah,
this
guiding,
idealized, this
yeah,
idealized state that, the Zen like moment we want to get to, not necessarily a set of
yeah,
instructions, right?
yeah. And so I'm working with some folks and we're trying to come up with what's next, right?
Yeah.
And it's not a framework, but it's going to look like a framework, right? Because I think it has to be somewhat commoditized. I think that's why design thinking is caught on, right? Despite it's not that, super awesome all the time, and design sprints, right? It was easy to digest, right? And, Agile has training and, Scrum has training. And so that in order to compete with those ideas or those ideologies, if you will, we're going to have to make something that's commoditized.
Yep.
And the idea is, to have just to separate out the differences between the what and the how when it comes from the move from uncertainty to certainty, right?
Okay.
So
Yep.
the trajectory of what we need to do and what the solution is doesn't need to be exactly the same from uncertain to certain as the how, right? And so Agile sort of mashes those things together. And that you've been through that, right? That can get really messy, right? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't collaborate with the how, right? But it just
Yep.
means that that we can be certain about the what before we're very certain about the how, right? So we can be very certain about the what. Those two don't need to be in sync. And I think where I've worked and where we've done that, where we've separated those two, we've had great results, right? The team, everything flows really well. And then you just have to have really great communication between the developers and the
Right.
designers and the product folks to handle situations that come up that you have to deal with, which is part of Agile. It's change, right? So we came up with something, we tested it, it worked great for users. We're going to put it out there and oh my gosh, we missed something. The scope on this piece is much bigger. We just didn't see it before. Fine. Let's negotiate a way forward, right? There's lots of not wrong solutions. That's the truth. But you kind of want to know before you put it in front of users, or at least users that are paying you money or could potentially pay you money, right? That it's not wrong, right? Which we use the scientific method. That's what it tells you. It tells you if you're not wrong. That's all it
Yep.
can really tell you is if you're not wrong. And so then it becomes a question of how much risk do we need to mitigate to feel comfortable, right?
Right.
That we're not wrong, right? Before we go to production. So in an example, when you're developing software that's going to be used in a medical lab or, in a
Hmm.
hospital in ER, you got to be darn sure that that software is mistake
Yeah.
free and highly usable, right? Because any moment could be just disaster. So you're going to test that at a much higher bar than say an e-commerce application, right?
Right.
Like, that's far less critical.
Right.
The risk of being wrong there is far less critical. And so that's to me where the scope needs to change, right? We need to
Yeah.
understand
It's
that
not a one
take
size
this
fits all.
right. And there also needs to be scale from, hey, I'm a startup, I want to use this. I'm a mid-sized company, I want to use this. And I'm a huge company and I want to use this. Right. So
Yep.
we need to have those different scales and the different roles, just like Scrum does, just like, other agile frameworks do.
Yep.
And then we have to have those communication pathways that happen. So yes, it's going to look like a framework. I don't want it to be a framework, right? The
Sure.
concept is not to be, but it might end up being much like a framework just because that's what people seem to intake well. Um,
Well, I think again, to
a
your
good
point,
friend,
if
Debbie
it's
Levitt, had,
if it's
yeah,
a framework made of dotted lines that is flexible, right? Depending on where
yeah,
you're at. But I think the most important part is the part you talked about is the communication part, because you talked about it before about being able to
yeah,
communicate strategy. And I think where a lot of teams in the agile space fail is that they assume because they're doing the ceremonies and they're doing these things that communication is happening, or that they're following the framework, and they're assuming that because they're following the framework, because they plugged in play with these methodologies, that it's going to start working. And then they find that these are more cultural transformations in terms of communication and how people work together. And I think, to your point, David, that's where I see the failings happen the most often, is that people don't put an effort into that type of communication.
yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I think that's a communication across the board is a huge, how we communicate and what we communicate. Also how we make decisions, right? If the agile community talked more about how they make decisions and less about how they track and estimate stories, right? Like the agile community would be in a whole better place, right?
Yeah.
How do we decide to do this? How do we not decide to do this? Like, what are the criteria? Where do all our inputs come from? Nobody knows that, right? They just kind of come in, right? And so, how do we handle when an executive comes down and really wants this feature? We
Right.
put it in the discovery pipeline, and then we figure out if it's
Right.
worthwhile, and then we present that business back to the leader.
Yeah, or
And
our
if the
biggest
leader doesn't
customer
like
wants
yeah,
customization, um,
right.
to something that's going to take up a good third of the team's time, right?
Right. And we ran into this at Taylor, right? They had a big company, one big client who
Yep.
came in and they wanted this one feature, but then they're the only one that pretty much wanted that feature of their existing clients. And then as we looked across the entirety of of the print potential print market, it was, less than 1%, less than 1% by far, right? So it was less than 1% of 1% of the total potential revenue out there. So when you start to look at it from a different scale and a different scope, now we ended up going forward with that feature, but we modified it so it would fit more customers, right? So
Hmm.
we made some smart product decisions in the front to say, hey, we're going to tweak it like this. Is this okay? And everything
Right.
worked out all right. But at the same time, you have to have that filter. And that's what the product owner was supposed to do. But and there's great product owners that do.
Right.
I'm not trying to
Well, it's a turn
disparage product.
lemons into lemonade, right? So you, like you just
Right.
said, a great example is somebody who's taking actual ownership of the product and those requests coming in and saying, yes, executive or big client, this, I see how this feature would benefit you. Let me do some research and see how I could make
Yeah.
it benefit the rest of our
Right.
clients, right? And
Right.
spend some time doing that and presenting it back to them and saying, this is what I think the best solution is. It solves your
Right.
problem, plus it adds to everybody else's. And that type of autonomy in an environment is, I mean,
Yeah.
it takes ownership, not just frameworks and titles
It,
and ceremonies, right?
I've only seen it happen in small companies
Yeah,
where
sure.
the CEO or the executive has a great relationship with that product manager or product owner, and they can, have a conversation. At big companies, I've rarely ever seen it work, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Work and not, and not put the product manager or owner in a really bad spot,
Well,
right?
managing
That
up is
kind of,
much
that,
harder in a larger matrixed organization,
yeah.
right? And I've worked in small and I've
Right.
worked in big companies, and yeah, exactly to your point. Like I got really good at
Right.
getting the boss um, to think my ideas were their ideas,
Right.
and I was
Right.
able to move
Well,
the needle forward. But in a highly matrixed organization, where, you've got a
Yeah.
large medical device company, for example, and there's 400 vice presidents. It's very difficult
Right.
to move
Right.
that needle.
And that's
Right.
why abstracting it to a function or a team, I
Yeah,
think helps a lot, right?
sure.
So you're not putting in on one person. And then, the motto is everybody likes data till it disagrees with what they think.
Yeah,
Right. And
exactly.
so, but we create some empirical results that match the way we've all agreed. Again, back to communication, we've all agreed to make decisions and weigh things. And, if at that point an executive wants to say, nope, go ahead and do it anyway, you know what? We're going to go ahead and do it. I'm probably going to make them send me an email with that, but
Yeah,
you
I
know,
want some documentation because in six
I want you
months,
to
when it
tell
all
me.
blows up in our faces, I want to
Exactly.
make sure that you understand where the decisions
Right.
came
So,
from,
so you have
and the
accuracy to
direction
work.
came from.
How is that working? Right.
Yeah,
And
right.
the,
Yeah, that's how easy
not
they
that
forget.
more. Right. Right.
How easily they forget those requests. So
Right.
let's give some advice, David. So let's say I'm listening to this and I'm nodding my head a lot and I'm saying, yes, I do work in a company where this isn't working out that well. As an individual contributor, what's your suggestion for advice on what they could be doing to help improve the situation that they're in?
It's tough as an IC. It's tough as
Mhm.
an IC. I think you've got to get at least a team on board with you. And really the first thing that you can do is start within the team, separating out business value, user value, and tech value, right? So, or delivery value. Let's just say delivery value. Let's take tech out of it because it could be customer service or whatever else it could be. Let's take that out of it. And the user experience person represents the user's point of view. The product person represents the business point of view. In fact, I would rename them business, right? I would name them something to do with business. I haven't figured out what yet, but that's their role. Represent operational efficiency and revenue,
Business
right?
interest.
So profits. Yep. And then you have a delivery value. So let's say in this case, it's tech. Each of those teams decides how they want to represent that value to the others, but it all has to be even. Like it has to be a numeric scale, really simple. 1 to 10 is usually fine. And then, that's how you rate each feature as it comes in. That's how you decide. And so then you can, on the other side, then have a conversation about risk, right? So if the risk or cost, in some cases to implement something is high, you may want to test it more. If is low, you may not, right? So,
Hmm.
like adding a form, to your checkout process, probably not a big deal, right? We probably don't need to do a ton of research around that as long as we've got good form patterns in place. We've added 5 form fields to the checkout in the last 2 months. Okay, maybe it's time that we take a look at that holistically and step back and make that a
Right.
different conversation. Or we're adding a whole new loyalty feature. Okay, hold on. Right, we're going to interrupt the user's checkout flow, which we've already sort of primed and are priming and optimizing. And it's going to disrupt current optimization work that's already in flight. Okay, let's take a look at that and make sure that part's tight so we can isolate that as a problem right out of the scenario. So there's lots of things like that, even simple things within the group. But it really is about changing the conversation with the 3 different kinds of value and then the 3 different kinds of risk, because each of them has a risk involved. And that's to me is where it starts. That's where you start having smarter conversations within teams.
Mm.
You'll also start empowering your team to speak that way to stakeholders, and they'll understand that. They'll understand that better than the way we have conversations now about features, right? And then you start talking about value, which talks about impacts, right? Um, the other thing is KPIs.
Yeah.
So trying to set KPIs on the work that you're doing, right? As much as you can, even if they're micro KPIs. Don't get too caught up. Like if you're in e-com about overall conversion rate, that's important. But look at like your navigation. Your navigation's job is to get somebody to a category page.
Right.
Your category page is to get somebody to a product page. If you don't have those sorts of analytics, go get them.
Hmm.
They're commodity now, right? Google Analytics can do that. They can create funnels. They can create variable funnels. There's all sorts of stuff you can do now. It's not
Oh
like the
man,
dark
I
ages.
can't just
Ooh,
aside, like I can't
we
tell
could
you
see
how
a
many
visitor.
products I see without those basic analytics
Yeah.
attached to them.
I know. And so then you start getting into micro KPIs, and that allows you to isolate what you're doing. So whether you're launching a new feature or optimizing, that gives you a tracking mechanism for what's changing, how it's changing, why it's
Mhm.
changing is the next question. And then you can go answer that through research, right? That's where it starts, at a
Yeah.
very fine grained level. If if you're in user research right now, um, I would focus less on evaluative research and more on generative research, voice of the customer, being further up in the discovery funnel of problems, and then working with your product team to help figure out where it's where it's best to solve those, right? Should we solve it through operations? Is that what's best for the customer? How much does that cost us? How difficult is that, right? And this is
Yeah.
only time you'll ever hear me say estimating, and it's t-shirt sizing, right? So we need to
Sure.
know what the relative effort solving this problem through in these three different ways, right? We
Yep.
know that we don't know all how. We know that certainty is far away, but we kind of know what. And so we just need an idea. And then that helps guide us if we have a good product team and a good UX research team working together, then they can guide that and they can work with those stakeholders on those delivery mechanisms to understand the relative, you know,
Yeah.
the relative effort. And so to me, that's sort of where I see the two splits right now. You've got UX research and UX design, but I think it also applies to product and tech, right? If you as a tech team feel like the tech debt that's been forced upon you
Mm.
to, get something out the door is really, and I've worked in both. I've worked in areas where we didn't accept tech debt. And I'll tell you, it's nobody like that, right? Like where every tech debt was worked, there was none created. It was all, nobody like that because we weren't assessing the risk of that code, right? But nobody
Right.
likes rework either, which you have to be comfortable with rework. That's the whole idea of Agile, right? Like,
Right.
right. You're comfortable
Right.
with, like when people say things like, well, we can't change that. I'm like, we can't go back and work
Yeah.
on that again. I'm like,
Oh, yeah.
that's like entirely right. Right.
Yep. Yeah, it is. And I can't tell you how
So
many developers that I've known over the years that were like, let's do Agile because then I don't have to estimate. And I'm like, that's not what Agile is.
that's, that's not what it means. I mean, you may not have to estimate because I'm not a huge fan because I think by the time Agile
Sure.
estimates, who cares? Right. Like
Yeah.
you're the
Yeah.
product owner. You've got to work the 10 product. You got a list of 10 things. You're
True.
going to order them by important value. You may take some stabs at things that you might choose to elevate 5 things of little lesser value
Sure.
than the
Yep.
one big thing that you know is going to take a while for quick wins. But those are commodity decisions, right?
They are, but
We're not
again,
worried about those.
to build an
Yeah.
amazing team, you need accountability,
Yes.
not just talented individuals. People need to be accountable for what they say they
Well,
can do or will do or those sorts of things, right?
you only need accountability if people aren't delivering, right?
Well,
Like
exactly.
I've been on teams where nobody ever asked how much work we were getting done because we were delivering tons of good stuff all the time,
Yep, for
right?
sure.
And with
Yep.
very little bugs and, you know, and, and the speed was high, right? Now those were A+ rock star kind of teams, right? Which I've been spoiled a couple of times to be on. But the thing is that nobody cares about estimating if you're crushing, right? The only time I see teams talking about estimating is when they're not, when I see stakeholders talking about we need to get estimates or product people or scrum folks is when the team's not delivering.
That's
And,
fair.
and so that suggests to me that the real problem isn't estimating. It isn't
Right.
accountability. It's
Yeah,
digging into
it's
the team to figure out what the root
management
dysfunctions
problem,
are.
right?
Yeah. I
Yep.
mean, it could be that you've got a couple of developers that need upskilled. It could be that you've got a couple of developers who, are senior, but don't really understand the framework that you're using, whatever it is. It suggests to me that there's a bigger problem because I've really never met a developer that didn't want to deliver and deliver great stuff. Right.
Yep,
Um,
for sure.
and there's usually some dysfunction. So that's where I think estimating becomes sort of a crutch. And people will say, well, we estimate so that if two devs have different opinions of how long it should take, I'm like, that's a dev practice.
Right.
That's not an
Right.
agile practice. That's dev
Right.
practice. So that goes in the dev center of excellence, right? How do they mitigate that? Because if your team's mobbing or pairing, which are not popular words sometimes, but if they
Sure.
are, then estimating is really kind of not useful or if they're having a ton of asynchronous communication, right? If you're looking at Slack and the dev channel is just full of
Right.
back and
It's
forth about,
just a
oh, I'm doing
mess.
this and I
Yeah.
want to solve that, blah, 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 right? And they're coming back and forth. You may not need that level of, right, because they're already plugged in. And so again, to me, that's the, I want to say ideal state, but that's the good state. And if we're not there, then why aren't we there? Right. And
Yeah.
so why are we trying to solve a problem that's not the right way to solve it. But yeah, so
I love it.
to me, we talk about advice and with leaders is to learn, that's
Yeah.
the last group is to learn how to communicate and strategy, learn how to, and work with your team to figure out what they need, right, from you. Ask that question, but you can't just ask, what do you need? Because teams don't know, right? Sometimes they'll say, well, I don't really know what's coming. Well, how far is your product team's visibility is the edge of their backlog. That's what I always say, because they really can't see much further than that. So how do you give
Yep.
them glimpses of that? And
Sure.
that's going to be sometimes team specific, sometimes there's different ways, but um, I think communicating is a strategy is the most upskill that most leaders and stakeholders need across companies. Um, just because I don't think it's, where do you learn it? Unless somebody's taught it to you, it's not we're not humans. We're not super great at that as a
Yeah.
whole. Right. Um,
Yep.
I
You
have
gotta,
many household adventures. I could household projects that, between my wife and I, that could illustrate that we're,
yes.
that we as native humans are not great at
Yep.
communicating our strategy of how we're
Yep.
going to accomplish something. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
and so, at scale, with people that, don't have any investment in your personal, in your, in your personal, longevity, who's gonna help you, right? Like, it's just not something that I think leaders know how to do very well. And, I wish there was a course for it, because I would send it to anybody. If you find a course,
Yeah.
I'd love to share it.
Well,
I'd
there's
share
some
it
good
out
books
all over
out
the
there. I
place,
think the
because
five
it,
dysfunctions of a team and certain
yeah,
books like that are helpful in
yeah,
understanding and building, because I think it starts, some of that communication starts with empathy, right? Is wanting to understand the other person's
yeah,
position before you want your position understood, right? So I think there's
right,
but I think part of it just comes with um experience, right? A new manager is nervous and they think that command and control is going to make them successful, and they find, I find that people who stick with it find out over
yeah,
time, um they learn through more accidents than just being
right.
smart out the gate. So
But that's hard, right? If you're
it is hard.
accountable for
Yeah,
something,
it's tough.
you don't have command and control over something, it's tough. I
Yeah,
mean, to parallel, it's like parenting, right? When your kids become teenagers
for
and they can
sure.
drive and they're going, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm responsible for their safety.
Yep.
Yet they could make a
Right.
stop at Taco
Exactly.
Bell
Yes.
without letting
Exactly.
me know. Like,
Yeah.
all good, there certainly are boundaries and parameters that we work within, right? That we've provided. But at the same time, we have to trust that those outcomes, like my son gets himself to school every morning.
Yep.
I trust that that's what's happening, right?
Yes.
Like, even I'm
Yep. You
awake,
have to.
right? But I know it's how we leave, but I'm trusting he's going to school, right?
You
I'm
just have
trusting
to. Yeah.
that. And
Yep. Well,
right now I
cool.
have some feedback on that. I have to, like, Google Analytics at the
Yeah.
school lets me know, right? If that's not happening on a regular cadence, but uh, you know, that's not something that people rely on in real time.
That's true. Well, David, I could talk to you all day about this because I just find it so fascinating. So you'll have to come back on the show and we'll talk more about it, um, especially as you build up more experiences over time. So if I want to connect with you, David, if I want to fight you about Agile, if I want to compliment you, where's a good place to find you? Where's a great place to connect with you, David?
LinkedIn's the best place to connect with me through a message or I mean, I don't post a lot. I'm not heavy out there. I try not to be, too disruptive to the world with my presence. So, but it's just LinkedIn, it's super creative. So pretty easy to find. And so that's me. There's some other super creatives out there, but I think I'm the top one.
The
I'm
OG,
on top of the
the
pile there.
real, the real.
Yeah, the OG creative. But yeah, and so yeah, that's the best place to connect with me. And
Great.
then yeah, I don't do a lot of social, so that's that's the one place where I sort of let
That's where you
myself.
hang out. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
you and me both. I don't do a lot of social, but I do enjoy LinkedIn. Okay. So thank you again, David. And for those of you watching, there will be links in the description below so you can find David's profile. on LinkedIn. David, thanks again for taking the time. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for
All right.
looking forward to continuing the conversation in a later episode.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to join myself and David today. It was it just I enjoy having these discussions with David. We've had them for years, and I was so glad to get him on the show to talk about his perspective on Agile. So, and speaking of perspectives, you should get a new perspective on networking, and you can do that by picking up the Little Book of Networking, which is now available on Amazon, and finger guns that I'm doing with my hands right now to emphasize how important it is that you get that book. And if you do get it and you enjoy it, please leave a review. That's super helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I appreciate it. We'll see you next time.